Hello there, my peaceful dreamers. Tonight, we are diving into one of the most fascinating midnight sun theories ever explored. The idea that Bella Swan's legendary mental shield was never given to her at all. Built across the quiet years of an ordinary childhood, long before she ever set foot in Forks. And as we go deeper, you will start to see how this connects to something even darker. This is the midnight sun theory of Bella's shield. If there is a Twilight story you would love to fall asleep to next, tell me in the comments. I would love to create it for you. Now let us get cozy. Let your shoulders drop. Breathe in slowly. And let Bella's story carry you somewhere quiet. It begins long before the beginning. There were nights in Forks when the silence of the house felt less like peace and more like pressure. Our Edward had known silence before, in the technical sense. The absence of sound, the stillness of a room at 3 a.m, the hush of a forest far enough from any human settlement that even the distant hum of other minds faded to something manageable. He had sought that kind of silence deliberately across the decades, had driven himself into wilderness and solitude when the noise of human consciousness became too much to bear. He knew what silence was, but this was different. He lay in the darkness of his room on the 3rd floor of the Cullen house, perfectly still in the way that only the undead can be still. No breath, no heartbeat, no unconscious fidgeting of a body that needed to believe it was alive. And he thought about her, not about her blood, though that was always there, always present at the edge of every thought like a fire burning just outside the frame of a painting. He thought about her mind, about the place where her mind should have been and was not, about the particular quality of that absence, which was unlike anything in his century of experience, unlike anything he had words for, unlike anything he had ever expected to encounter in the endless, repetitive procession of human consciousnesses that had been the texture of his immortal existence. He had been trying to understand it for weeks. He approached the problem the way he approached everything, with the systematic, almost compulsive rigor of a mind that had spent 100 years with very little else to do. And he kept arriving at the same wall, the same complete, featureless, utterly impenetrable wall. What was she? Not what she was in the simple sense. He knew what she was in the simple sense. She was Isabella Swan, 17 years old, newly arrived from Phoenix, Chief Swan's daughter, clumsy and quiet, and possessed of the most extraordinary blood he had ever encountered in a century of trying not to notice such things. That much was not a mystery. The mystery was the other thing. The silence. The complete and effortless and absolutely consistent silence where her mind should have been broadcasting the way every other human mind broadcast. Loudly, constantly, involuntarily, the way a fire gives off heat without deciding to. He had spent weeks listening for her and hearing nothing, and it was the nothing that would not leave him alone. The principle he kept returning to was one he had developed gradually across the long decades through the accumulated experience of encountering hundreds of vampires in various configurations, covens and nomads and solitary wanderers, ancient and newly made, gifted and ungifted, aligned with the Volturi or fleeing from them. He had not articulated it to anyone, had not even fully articulated it to himself until recently. Because it was the kind of knowledge that lives in the body before it lives in the mind. An understanding built from pattern recognition rather than deliberate study. But the principle was this: gifts do not appear from nothing. Every vampire with an ability, every genuine supernatural gift, the kind that went beyond the standard enhancements of speed and strength and beauty that all of their kind shared, had been, in their human life, someone specific, someone whose particular quality of mind or sensitivity of spirit or strength of character was already visible before the transformation, already operating within the natural range of human variation, already shaping who they were and how they moved through the world. The transformation did not invent these qualities. It found them, and it amplified them past every human limitation. And it made permanent what had been fragile, and it made absolute what had been relative. He was himself the most obvious example. He had thought about this many times across the decades, turning it over with the self-consciousness of someone who knew his own history too well to romanticize it. Edward Mason, in his human life, 17 years of it, cut short by influenza in the autumn of 1918, had not been a telepath. Obviously, he'd been a boy, a fairly ordinary boy in many respects, given to music and reading and the quiet observation of the people around him, better at listening than speaking, more comfortable in the company of books than in the company of crowds. His mother had noticed it. His teachers had remarked upon it in the careful, slightly uneasy way that adults remark upon a child who seems to understand more than he should. He had been perceptive, unusually, perhaps uncomfortably perceptive. The kind of perceptive that made people feel simultaneously seen and exposed, that made him understand the gap between what someone said and what they meant before he could fully articulate how he knew the difference. He read people the way some children read music, not as a skill that had to be learned, but as a natural language, as obvious as the words they were actually speaking, as present and legible as the expression on their face. The transformation had taken that, had taken the natural human fallible perceptiveness of a boy who was good at reading people, and had rebuilt it at the cellular level, had woven it into the new architecture of his vampire consciousness, had elevated it from intuition to fact, from impression to certainty, from the soft focus of human empathy to the relentless, unwanted, absolute clarity of minds laid open. He did not read people anymore. He heard them, whether he chose to or not, whether they chose to share or not, whether the information was something he wanted or something that would haunt him. He heard. The gift was a human trait, made perfect and inescapable. Carlyle was the second example he returned to most often, because Carlyle was the one he knew best, had watched most closely across the longest span of time. 3 centuries of choosing, again and again, the harder path, of placing himself in the environments most likely to overwhelm him. Emergency rooms, epidemic wards, the controlled chaos of a hospital at 2 a.m, and choosing, with full awareness of what he was choosing against, not to give in to the hunger that was always present, always available, always offering the simple and terrible relief of simply taking what was offered. His resistance to thirst was extraordinary even among their kind. Other vampires found it almost incomprehensible, this century upon century of discipline. They assumed it must get easier. Carlyle had never told them that it did not. But Carlyle, as a human, as the son of an Anglican pastor in 17th century London, as a young man who had chosen to believe in the possibility of goodness even after his transformation had given him every reason to abandon the belief, had already been someone whose commitment to healing overrode his own physical discomfort and personal cost. He had chosen his path before the transformation. The transformation had simply made the stakes of that choice immeasurably higher, and Carlyle had continued choosing, because that was who he was, because that was the dominant, defining, absolute characteristic of his humanity, now elevated to something that other vampires found almost supernatural in its own right. Alice had been institutionalized as a human. Her visions in their human form had been fragmentary and frightening. Images that arrived without context, without the precision her vampire consciousness would eventually bring to them, raw and unasked for and impossible to explain to the people around her, who could not see what she saw. They had looked at her and seen madness. The transformation had taken what looked like madness and rebuilt it as a gift, the same underlying sensitivity, the same orientation of her consciousness toward the possible rather than the actual, toward futures rather than the present, remained the defining feature. It had simply been given the architecture it needed to function, instead of the architecture that had made it a torment. Jasper had been a soldier, a young Confederate officer with a gift for managing the emotional temperature of the men under his command, an intuitive understanding of morale and fear, and the way collective emotional states could shift a battle's outcome as decisively as superior numbers. His superiors had noted it. His men had felt it without being able to name it. He had not been performing emotional management. He had been operating from a natural sensitivity to the emotional field of a group, a responsiveness so acute that it allowed him to influence the field as well as read it. The transformation had made this literal, had turned what was influence into the ability to directly alter what people felt, had turned responsiveness into control. The human version had been a skill. The vampire version was a power. He thought sometimes about Rosalie, about what it meant that she developed no gift, or rather, no gift beyond the standard enhancements that all of their kind received. She was the most beautiful of them in the conventional sense, a beauty so extreme it had been the defining fact of her human life, the thing everyone saw first, the lens through which everything else about her was filtered. He had his own quiet theory about this, which he had never shared with her because she would not have welcomed it, and he suspected that the transformation had amplified Rosalie's most dominant human trait, as it always did, and that her most dominant human trait had already been beauty. The enhancement was real. It simply wasn't legible as a gift in the way that telepathy or foresight was legible. It didn't produce an ability. It produced something more like an intensification, The transformation could only work with what was there. If what was most fundamentally there was a physical quality, rather than a quality of mind or spirit, the result looked different, which brought him back to Bella. He turned the question in his mind with the careful deliberation he brought to problems that mattered. If her impermeability to his gift was a vampire gift in his human pre-transformation form, if what she was right now in this ordinary human life in Forks, Washington, was already the precursor of something that the transformation would one day elevate to its absolute expression, then it must trace back to something she already was, something already present, something already operating as the dominant characteristic of her human psychology, already shaping her experience, already distinguishing her from the people around her in ways that might be subtle enough to miss if you weren't paying attention. The human trait that became the vampire gift. What was hers? He reached toward where her mind should have been, as he had done 100 times already, and found the same thing. Nothing. Not the blurred signal of a mind he couldn't quite tune into. Not the muffled quality of someone whose thoughts were simply not very loud. Not the guarded quality of someone actively suppressing what they were thinking. Nothing. The complete and total and effortlessly maintained absence of any outward-facing surface for his gift to encounter. She did not broadcast. She never had. Not once in all the weeks he had been trying. Every other gift he had observed traced back to a single dominant trait. His own gift traced back to perceptiveness. Carlyle's resistance traced back to compassion and self-discipline. Alice's foresight traced back to precognitive sensitivity. Jasper's empathic power traced back to emotional attunement. Each one, a single quality amplified to its logical extreme. Bella's shield, in the vampire form it would one day take, was not one thing. It was total. It would block everything. Not just his telepathy, but every form of mental intrusion and every power that operated through the medium of consciousness. To be that comprehensive, to be that complete, it could not trace back to something narrow or specific. It had to trace back to something equally total, something equally fundamental. Not a habit she had developed, not a skill she had learned, not a preference she had cultivated. Something structural, something built into the deep organization of her mind, as basic and as permanent as the architecture of bone. He lay in the stillness of his room and understood, for the first time, that finding the origin of Bella's silence would require him to look not at who she was, but at how she had been made. Not at the surface features of her personality, but at the forces that had shaped her long before she arrived in Forks, long before she walked into his biology class and stopped his world with the impossible combination of her blood and her silence. Somewhere in her past, something had built this. He was certain of it. A gift this complete, this absolute, this effortlessly maintained did not emerge from nothing. It had been constructed, slowly, without awareness, without intention, the way all the most durable structures are constructed, not from a single grand decision, but from 1,000 small ones, from pressure and necessity and the quiet daily work of a mind that had been given a problem it needed to solve. He would start at the beginning. He would trace it backward. He would find where the silence began. The first time Edward read Charlie Swan's mind with genuine, focused attention, not the casual ambient awareness he maintained of everyone within range, but the deliberate investigative concentration he reserved for things that mattered. He was sitting in the Swan living room on a Tuesday evening in February, enduring one of Charlie's careful, suspicious appraisals, while simultaneously conducting one of his own. Charlie was doing what Charlie always did in Edward's presence, watching. Not with hostility exactly, though hostility was available to him when he felt it was warranted, and Edward had heard it clearly enough on the occasions when he'd given Charlie genuine reason for concern. This was something quieter than hostility. This was the watchfulness of a man whose profession had taught him that the most important information was usually the information people didn't intend to give you, and on whose nature had inclined him toward that understanding long before his profession confirmed it. Charlie Swan observed. He catalogued. He waited for the thing that didn't fit. He had been doing this his entire adult life, and he was very good at it. And the fact that he was doing it to Edward now, that Edward was the thing being watched, the thing being assessed for the detail that didn't quite align, would have been more unsettling if Edward hadn't been doing exactly the same thing in return. Edward found to his considerable surprise that reading Charlie Swan's mind required something he almost never needed when reading human minds: effort. Most human consciousness was not difficult to access, difficult to endure, frequently, difficult to filter, almost always, but difficult to access. In the sense of requiring focused attention to receive clearly. Almost never. Human minds broadcast. That was simply what they did. As natural and as involuntary as breathing, as unconscious as the heartbeat that kept them alive. They generated a constant, layered, simultaneous signal that Edward received whether he chose to or not. Surface thoughts and background anxieties and physical sensations and emotional undercurrents, all of it present at once, all of it reaching him with the indiscriminate generosity of a radio tower that had no concept of a private frequency, that could not have chosen to direct its signal, even if it had understood that a receiver existed. Charlie's mind did not do this. His thoughts arrived one at a time, deliberately, almost carefully, and with gaps between them that felt intentional, even though Edward could tell with absolute certainty that they were not. Charlie was not pausing to consider what he allowed himself to think. He was not editing or suppressing or managing his interior life with any conscious effort. The gaps were simply there. Natural spaces in the signal, as if the broadcasting apparatus itself were built differently from every other human mind Edward had encountered. Calibrated to a lower frequency, constitutionally disinclined toward the kind of constant, pressurized outward transmission that characterized every other consciousness he had ever been forced to inhabit alongside its owner. He sat in Charlie's living room and listened, and what he heard was a man thinking about Bella, about whether she was happy, about whether the boy sitting across from him was the reason she seemed happier than Charlie had ever known her to be, and whether that was a good thing or a complicated thing, and whether happiness purchased through another person rather than through one's own circumstances was the durable kind. Charlie did not think in long, connected, fully formed sentences the way some people did. He thought in fragments, in images, in the particular compressed language of a mind that had spent decades communicating primarily with itself and had developed a private shorthand for the things it returned to most often. The feeling was always there before the words, and the words often never arrived at all, and Charlie, had long since stopped noticing this as a gap in his experience. It was simply how thinking felt. It was simply how he was, and there was nothing unusual about the content. A father thinking about his daughter, turning over the question of her happiness with the quiet, patient attention of someone who understood that the question mattered and had no idea how to answer it. Edward had heard 10,000 variations of this particular frequency of parental concern across the decades. What was unusual, what made him lean in, metaphorically, with the focused attention he would later recognize as the beginning of his real investigation into Bella's silence, was the form, the quietness of it, the way the thoughts did not press outward, did not reach toward the room, did not broadcast themselves into the space between Charlie and the boy he was watching with such careful, measured attention. The thoughts existed inside Charlie and stayed inside Charlie, completely and without residue. Edward had encountered guarded minds before. He knew what it felt like when someone was actively suppressing their thoughts. The particular quality of mental strain involved, the sense of pressure building behind a surface being held in place by effort, the way suppressed thoughts always, inevitably, grew louder the harder someone tried to push them down. Suppression was almost comic in its self-defeating quality. The mind that most desperately wanted to keep something private was always the loudest, always the most legible, always the one most thoroughly broadcasting the very thing it was trying to conceal. That was not what was happening with Charlie. There was no effort. There was no strain. There was no sense of anything being held against its will. The quietness was not a performance, and not a discipline, and not the result of years of practiced self-control. It was simply how he was made. Charlie Swan was not a man who leaked. Edward considered this for a long time, across many evenings in that small living room, across many careful appraisals and halting conversations, and the particular kind of silence that Charlie and Bella seemed to share with equal comfort. A silence that required nothing of either of them, that was not uncomfortable or charged or heavy with the weight of things unsaid, but simply present, simply the natural state of two people who were related in both blood and temperament, and who had long since stopped apologizing for the fact that words were not their primary language. Other people found the silences between them strange. Edward had heard Jessica Stanley think about it. The slightly uncomfortable quality of watching Bella and her father exist together in a room without filling the room with conversation, the way most people felt compelled to do. Jessica found it odd. Angela found it quietly beautiful in her generous way, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Edward found it illuminating, because the silence between Charlie and Bella was not practiced. It was not the result of two people who had agreed, over time, to stop trying to talk to each other. It was inherited. They shared it the way people share a jawline or a particular way of moving through a room, not because they had agreed to, not because they had learned it from each other, but because it was in them, because it was the natural expression of something that ran through the line between them, something constitutional, something that existed at a level deeper than personality or preference or the choices people make about how to present themselves to the world. He began to watch Charlie more carefully, not just in the Swan living room, but in the context where Charlie existed most fully as himself. At the police station, which Edward drove past often enough to catch the edge of his thoughts through the walls. At the diner where Charlie ate most of his lunches, his mind quiet and contained even in the company of people he had known for 20 years. At the hardware store, at the gas station, in the particular Saturday morning routines of a man who had built a life that fit him the way a well-worn coat fits, without constraint, or without pretension, without any particular awareness of how unusual it was to be so thoroughly and uncomplicatedly oneself. Charlie did not perform his interiority. He did not cultivate it. He simply inhabited it, the way he inhabited the small house on the edge of town that he had lived in for so long. It had stopped being a place he lived and had become simply an extension of the space he occupied in the world. What he found across all of these observations was a man who had built his entire existence around the primacy of inward experience, not as a spiritual practice, not as a chosen philosophical orientation toward the contemplative life, simply as the natural expression of a character that has always found the interior world more reliable, more navigable, more genuinely his own than the exterior one. And Charlie felt things with considerable depth. Edward could hear that clearly enough in the fragments that did reach the surface, in the compressed emotional shorthand of his private thinking, in the way certain subjects, Bella, Renee, the divorce, the years of Bella's absence, the particular quality of the loneliness he had built his life around without ever quite naming it as loneliness, carried a weight in his thoughts that was completely disproportionate to the minimal space he gave them in conversation. The depth was not in question. The depth was, in its way, extraordinary. What was notable, what was the distinguishing feature of Charlie Swan's interior life, was the almost complete absence of the infrastructure that would normally translate that depth into any form of external expression. He watched Charlie try to talk to Bella, watched the man open his mouth with some intention of saying something real, find the words insufficient before they even fully formed, and close it again. Watched him offer a fishing trip instead of a conversation, a shared meal instead of a declaration. The simple and steady and completely genuine fact of his presence, instead of the articulation of what that presence meant and had always meant and would continue to mean regardless of whether he ever found a way to say so. It was not repression in the clinical sense. Edward had read enough minds in enough clinical contexts across the decades to understand the difference between repression and constitution. Repression had a particular texture, a heat, a sense of things actively held below the surface against their own pressure, straining toward release. And Charlie's unexpressed feelings were not straining. They were not struggling to get out. They simply had no reliable pathway to the surface. The channel between interior experience and exterior expression had always been narrow in him, had perhaps been narrow from the very beginning, and he had long since stopped experiencing this as a loss or a failure or a thing that needed to be corrected. It was simply how he functioned. The feeling existed fully and genuinely. The transmission didn't, and he had made a life that accommodated this the way you accommodate any fundamental fact about yourself, not by fixing it, but by building around it. Bella had grown up watching this, more than watching it. She'd grown up inside it, had absorbed it in the wordless, unpreconscious way that children absorb the fundamental grammar of the world they first encounter. before she had language for any of it, before she had the cognitive architecture to analyze or compare, or even notice what was particular about the household she had been born into. She had been living inside Charlie's particular relationship between interior and exterior, had been breathing the air of a world where feeling and transmitting were simply not the same thing, where the inside stayed inside, not because it was hiding anything, not because there was anything shameful or dangerous about what the inside contained, but simply because that was the nature of the inside. It belonged to itself. It did not owe the exterior its contents. This was the first layer of Charlie's inheritance to her, and not a lesson he had taught her, and not a quality he had modeled for her in any conscious way, because Charlie was not conscious of it himself. It was simply who he was, and she had been small enough and close enough and formative enough in her development to absorb it before either of them had any idea that absorption was happening. The structural orientation toward interiority, the baseline comfort with the gap between feeling and saying, the constitutional ease with the idea that a thought did not have to go anywhere to be complete, that an emotion did not have to be expressed to be fully experienced, that the private world of the interior was its own sufficient country and did not require a foreign policy. She had not learned to be interior from Charlie. She had simply been interior, the way he was interior, and because the world she had first learned to inhabit was his world, and his world was quiet in this particular and constitutional way, and the mind builds itself according to what it first encounters, and what Bella's mind first encountered was the understanding that the inside and the outside were separate territories with no required connection between them. Edward considered the implications of this across the long nights when Bella's silence had become the primary occupation of his mind. He had spent a century operating on the implicit assumption that consciousness was fundamentally exterior in its orientation, that minds reached outward as a matter of course, that the broadcasting was as involuntary as the heartbeat, that the only variable was the volume and clarity of the signal, rather than whether the signal existed at all. And Charlie had made him reconsider this in a way that felt genuinely important. Charlie suggested that the inclination to broadcast might itself be a variable, that some minds were constitutionally more interior than others, that the tendency to transmit, to project thought and feeling outward into the available space, to make the interior world legible to the exterior one, to reach toward the world with the contents of the self, might be something that varied across individuals the way all temperamental qualities varied, heritable in the way that temperament is heritable, as fundamental to the person and as unremarkable in its particularity as the color of their eyes or the timbre of their voice. Charlie did not broadcast because broadcasting was not in his nature. His thoughts stayed inside because inside was simply where thoughts lived, and in his particular and constitutional experience of having thoughts. And Bella, developing in the field of that particular nature during the years when the mind is most plastic, most receptive, most fundamentally shaped by what it finds itself embedded in, had inherited something of its orientation, had taken on, before she had any ability to choose or resist or even notice, the same baseline tendency toward interiority, the same natural inclination to hold rather than release, to keep rather than transmit, to experience fully without the outward-facing expression that most human minds produced as automatically as breath. But here, Edward's thinking encountered a distinction that mattered enormously. That was in fact the hinge on which the entire theory turned. Charlie Swan, for all his quietness, for all the unusual and even striking degree to which his mind stayed inside itself and declined to broadcast into the surrounding space, Charlie Swan was not unreadable. He was difficult. He required effort and attention and a kind of focused listening that Edward almost never had to bring to a human mind. But he was accessible. When Edward concentrated, when he brought his full investigative attention to bear on the signal Charlie produced, he could hear him, softly, with gaps in the compressed and private shorthand of a man who had never expected anyone to be listening, but he could hear him. Charlie's thoughts did not reach outward, but they existed at the surface. They were there, in the way that a quiet conversation in the next room is there if you press your ear to the wall and attend to it carefully. Bella was not like that, and the difference between Charlie and Bella, in terms of what Edward's gift encountered when it reached toward them, was not a difference of degree. It was not that Bella was simply quieter than her father, more interior, more constitutionally inclined toward the private. It was a difference of kind so complete that the two experiences had almost nothing in common except the direction of their departure from the norm. Charlie was a whisper in a world of shouts. Bella was an absence so total it had its own quality, its own texture, its own particular and extraordinary presence in the landscape of his perception. The presence of something that was not there, experienced with a clarity that nothing he had ever encountered had prepared him for. She did not broadcast quietly. She did not broadcast at all, and there was no surface to press his awareness against, no frequency to strain toward, no sense of a signal that was simply too faint to receive clearly. When he reached toward where her mind should have been, with every bit of the investigative focus that had allowed him, over a century, to read minds through walls and across crowded rooms and in the midst of chaos and crisis and every kind of human complexity, he found nothing, not the nothing of an empty room, which still has the quality of a space that could be occupied. Something cleaner than that, something more complete, the nothing of a space that had no opening, that had no surface at all that faced outward, which meant that what Charlie had given her was real and significant and foundational, and was not enough by itself to account for what she was. The genetic inclination toward interiority, the constitutional tendency to hold rather than transmit, to keep the interior world private without conscious effort, this was the raw material, the starting disposition, the predisposition from which something more could develop, if the conditions required it, if the pressure was sufficient, if the necessity was real enough and sustained enough and fundamental enough to drive a developing mind toward the construction of something more complete than a simple temperamental quietness. The tendency was Charlie's gift to her, passed down not through teaching, but through inheritance, not through intention, but through the simple and unremarkable fact of being the first world she inhabited, the first mind she was close to, and the first example of what a person's relationship with their own interior life could look like. He had given her a foundation, a mind already inclined toward holding its own contents, already oriented toward the private rather than the exterior, already comfortable with the understanding that feeling and transmitting were separate acts that did not require each other, What he had not given her was a reason to take that inclination and develop it, to press it further, to strengthen it layer by layer across the years of childhood and adolescence, until the inclination had become a structure, and the structure had become a system, and the system had become something so complete and so automatic that even a vampire with a century of practice at reading every kind of human mind could find no surface in it, no frequency, no opening of any kind. And that had not come from Charlie. Charlie's world was quiet. Charlie's world was contained. But Charlie's world had never posed the particular kind of pressure that drives a mind toward the construction of genuine protection. He was steady. He was present in his quiet, limited way. He was the kind of parent whose love was never in question, even when its expression was almost entirely absent. And there was a safety in that, a reliability, a sense that the foundation held even when it said nothing. The pressure, the sustained, daily, foundational pressure that had taken Charlie's inherited gift of interiority and transformed it into something of an entirely different order, had come from the other side of Bella's inheritance entirely, from the woman who was everything Charlie was not, from the loud, vivid, overwhelming, endlessly present, and endlessly projecting force of nature who had been Bella's primary world for the first 17 years of her life, who had shaped her in ways that neither of them had ever fully understood, who had posed for the developing mind of a small girl in Phoenix, a problem so specific and so persistent and so fundamental that the only adequate response had been architectural. Charlie Swan had given Bella a quiet foundation, the structure that would eventually become the most impenetrable mental shield in the vampire world had been built, one ordinary day at a time, in response to Renee. The first time Edward encountered Renee Dwyer's mind directly, he understood immediately and with complete clarity why Bella Swan was the way she was. Not the full understanding. Not yet. That would come later, there assembled piece by piece from everything he had observed and theorized and turned over in the long quiet of his sleepless nights, in the careful and increasingly obsessive way that he had come to approach the question of Bella's silence. But the first encounter with Renee's consciousness gave him the foundational piece, the single clarifying element that made everything else cohere, the way a single key term makes a previously incomprehensible sentence suddenly and completely legible. He had been building his theory from the outside in, from Bella's silence, back through Charlie's quietness, back toward the origin he had suspected must exist somewhere in her history, in the specific and formative pressures of a childhood he had not witnessed, but had been gradually assembling from the evidence available to him. And then Renee arrived in Phoenix during Bella's hospital recovery, and Edward encountered her mind for the first time, and the theory stopped being a theory and became something closer to a certainty. Renee's mind was unlike anything he had encountered in a human being who possessed no supernatural explanation for it. He had encountered loud minds before, minds that broadcast with particular force and urgency, that projected their contents into the surrounding space with an intensity that made them difficult to filter even by his standards, that seemed constitutionally incapable of the ordinary modulation between interior experience and exterior expression that characterized most human consciousness. He had encountered minds so consumed by their own activity that they barely registered the existence of the world outside themselves, and so self-referential that every external event was immediately processed through the lens of what it meant for the self. He had encountered minds that were vivid and quick and endlessly generative, producing thought after thought in rapid succession without apparent effort or intention, a kind of mental abundance that was occasionally beautiful to witness, and more often simply exhausting to be near. Renee's mind was all of these things simultaneously, but it was also something else, something Edward did not have a ready category for, something that required him to sit with the experience of it for some time before he could articulate what made it so qualitatively different from the other loud and vivid and forceful human consciousnesses he had encountered across his long existence. It was not simply the volume of her thoughts, or their vividness, or the speed at which they generated and transformed and gave way to new ones. It was their direction. Her thoughts did not stay inside her. This was the thing. This was the precise and specific and enormously significant thing that distinguished Renee's mind from every other powerful human consciousness Edward had encountered. Most human minds, even the loudest ones, even the most vivid and forceful and constantly generative ones, existed within the person who possessed them. Their thoughts reached Edward because his gift received them, because he was, in the most literal sense, tuned to a frequency that human minds broadcast on, regardless of whether those minds intended to broadcast or had any awareness that they were doing so. The broadcasting was involuntary, but it was still, in some fundamental and important sense, contained. The signal left the person, but the source remained inside. The mind was interior, even when it was loud, even when it was overwhelming, even when it produced a signal so powerful that Edward had to actively work to filter it to a manageable level. The signal was still, at its origin, housed inside the person who was generating it. Renee's thoughts moved outward as their primary direction of travel. They did not simply broadcast in the passive sense of emitting a signal that happened to reach a receiver. They pressed into the available space around her with an almost physical quality, with the insistent forward motion of something that was not content to remain in one place, that needed to make contact with whatever surrounded it, that was organized, and at its most fundamental level, around the act of reaching outward rather than the act of remaining contained within itself. There was a difference between a fire that gives off heat as a byproduct of burning and a fire that is actively, intentionally directed toward a target. Most human minds were the former. Renee was the latter, except that the direction was not intentional. It was constitutional. She did not choose to project. She could not have chosen otherwise. Edward sat in the hospital corridor outside Bella's room and felt this reaching, and understood something he had not understood before about what Bella's childhood had been. Not the full understanding. That would require time and reflection, and the careful work of assembling the specific details of what he was observing into a coherent picture of what must have been. But the beginning of understanding arrived in that hospital corridor with a clarity that was almost physical in its force, because what he was experiencing in those first minutes of genuine exposure to Renee's mind was something that most human adults would find profoundly disorienting. An emotional and psychological field so powerful and so pervasive that it reorganized the surrounding space according to its own requirements, quietly and completely, and without any awareness on the part of the person generating it that any reorganization was occurring. He had encountered something like this before in Jasper. The ability to project emotional states outward, to alter the feeling tone of a room through the deliberate extension of an empathic gift that was itself the amplified form of a human sensitivity. But Jasper's projection was conscious, controlled, the exercise of a power he understood and deployed with intention. Renee's was none of these things. It was raw. It was entirely involuntary. And because it was involuntary, because it operated without the moderating influence of awareness or intention, it was in some ways more complete than Jasper's careful, directed use of his gift. It filled every available space. It left no corner of the surrounding environment unaffected. It simply was, the way weather is, the way atmosphere is, the way the basic conditions of a given environment are. Present, pervasive, and requiring no permission from anyone to exert its full effect on everything within its range. The effect of Renee's mental projection on the people around her was not dramatic in the way that supernatural powers are dramatic. It did not announce itself. It could not be pointed to and named in ordinary human terms, could not be described in any language that did not immediately sound like an exaggeration or a misinterpretation of something more mundane. It operated below the threshold of conscious awareness, in the register of feeling rather than thought, in the subtle and continuous reorganization of attention and priority and orientation that happens when a powerful emotional field enters a shared space and quietly, completely rearranges everything in it according to its own requirements. People near Renee found themselves oriented toward her, not because she demanded it, not because she was manipulative in any conscious or deliberate sense. Renee was, by every measure Edward could apply to the contents of her mind, and the genuine warmth and good intention that saturated those contents, a loving and well-meaning person who wanted nothing but the happiness of the people around her, and had very little awareness of the effect her presence had on the emotional landscape those people were trying to navigate. But the field she generated pulled, the way gravity pulls, without malice, without awareness, without any intention beyond the basic fact of its own existence and the simple, irresistible physics of what it was. He watched Phil Dwyer move through the hospital room during those days in Phoenix. Nassan tracked in Phil's thoughts the specific quality of a person who had spent years inside Renee's gravitational field and had organized himself around it so thoroughly and so gradually that the organization had become invisible to him, had ceased to feel like an accommodation he was making, and had simply become the way he was, the baseline of his experience, the unremarkable texture of daily life with the woman he loved. Phil's attention was always partly on Renee, not in the devoted, conscious way of a person who had chosen to prioritize their partner, who was making an active decision in every moment to attend to someone else's needs ahead of their own, in the automatic, structural, entirely unconscious way of a person whose nervous system had simply recalibrated itself across years of proximity to treat Renee's emotional state as a primary variable in every calculation it made. He tracked her moods without deciding to track them. He adjusted his behavior in response to her needs before she had expressed them, often before she had fully formed them herself. responding to the early signals of her emotional weather with the fluency of someone who had learned the language so thoroughly that it no longer registered as a language at all, but simply as the way things were. He was not weak or diminished by this. He was a capable and independent person in every context that did not involve Renee. But in her presence, the organization of his attention and his priorities and his moment-to-moment behavioral choices reflected at every level the unconscious primacy of her field. He was in the field. He had been shaped by the field. And because he had come to Renee as an adult, with decades of independent existence behind him, with a self that had been formed before the field existed in his life, the shaping had limits. There were parts of him that remained outside it, that existed in the spaces of his life that Renee did not occupy, that reasserted their independence in her absence. He had resources she had never touched. Bella had had none of these things. Bella had been born into the field, had opened her eyes onto a world in which Renee's outward-reaching, space-filling, constantly projecting consciousness was not something she had encountered and had to learn to navigate. It was simply the primary fact of existence, as fundamental and as unquestioned as gravity, as pervasive and as simply there as the air of the apartment in Phoenix, the warmth of the rooms, the particular quality of light through the windows on an ordinary afternoon. She had not encountered Renee's projection as something external that arrived and had to be accommodated. She had encountered it as the world itself, as the texture of what it felt like to exist, as the basic atmospheric condition of the only reality she had ever known. There had never been a before. There had never been a baseline from which to measure the field, because the field was the baseline, had always been the baseline, would remain the baseline for the entirety of the years that mattered most, the years when the mind is building itself from whatever materials the environment provides. The phenomenon that results from this, from growing up as the primary person in the close orbit of someone whose emotional world exerts this kind of constant, in unconscious structural pull, has been observed and described and named in the language of human psychology and developmental theory, though the name does not capture the full texture of the experience, does not convey the particular quality of what it is to grow up this way from the very beginning. Parentification, the gradual, unintentional, thoroughly sincere process by which a child assumes emotional responsibilities that belong developmentally to the adult, becomes a reader of the adult's interior weather, the manager of the adult's emotional needs, the one who monitors and responds and adjusts and accommodates, because the adult's needs are louder and more immediate and more constantly present in the available space than the child's quieter and less insistent and less practiced ones. And because someone has to do this work, and because the child is there, and because the child loves the adult, and because children are extraordinarily adaptive in ways that serve the people around them long before those adaptations are recognized as the significant and structural things they are. Edward heard it in everything Bella did and said and was, not just in the obvious surface features, the way she cooked and managed the household with a competence that belonged to someone decades older, the way she organized practical life with an efficiency that spoke of long practice at making things work smoothly without being asked. Those were the visible manifestations, the behavioral evidence that any observant person could have noted. What Edward heard, more deeply and more revealingly, was the structural quality of her attunement to the people around her, and the way she tracked emotional states with a fluency and an automaticity that went far beyond ordinary empathy or social awareness. The way she was always in some quiet and continuous part of her attention, monitoring, reading the room before she entered it, assessing the emotional temperature of a conversation before she spoke, calibrating her own responses not to what she felt or thought or wanted to express, but to what the situation required, what the person in front of her needed, what would keep the emotional environment stable and manageable and safe. She had been doing this since before she could walk. It was not a skill she had developed. It was a reflex she had been shaped into by the specific and sustained pressure of a childhood in which reading the primary adult's emotional state was as necessary as any other form of navigation, as fundamental as learning which parts of the floor creaked and which drawer stuck and which combination of words would smooth over a difficult moment before it became a difficult hour. But the asymmetry that Edward found most significant, the detail that most directly illuminated the specific mechanism by which the shield had formed, wasn't Bella's extraordinary attunement to the external emotional world. It was the contrast between that attunement and a relationship with her own interior life. She received, constantly and with great sophistication, and with a fluency that most people never developed at any age. She transmitted almost nothing, as she understood people with a depth and a precision that was genuinely unusual. She was understood by almost no one, including Edward increasingly suspected herself. This was not an accident of personality. It was not the natural variation of introversion or shyness, or the simple preference some people have for privacy over disclosure. It was the direct and specific and structurally embedded product of the adaptation her developing mind had made to the environment Renee had created. Because the fundamental problem that Renee's constant outward projection had posed for a small child growing up inside it was not a problem of love or safety or material provision. Renee loved Bella with a completeness and a genuineness that Edward could hear in every corner of her thoughts. The problem was not love. The problem was spatial. The problem was that Renee's interior life took up the available room. Her needs and her moods and her enthusiasms and her anxieties and her vivid, constantly shifting, powerfully projected inner world filled the shared space of the household so thoroughly, so continuously, and so completely without awareness of the filling, that the child who lived inside that household faced a specific and recurring and essentially unanswerable question about where her own interior life was supposed to exist. A child's interior life is not optional. It is not a luxury that can be deferred until more space becomes available. It is the substance of the self, the place where the person is formed and stored and continuously developed across the years of growth. It has to exist somewhere. It has to have territory. And if the shared space of the external world is already fully occupied, if the available room in the household's emotional landscape is already claimed, not through malice or intention, but through the simple and irresistible physics of a more powerful field, then the child's interior life has to find its territory somewhere else, somewhere that is not the shared space, somewhere that the external field cannot reach. Bella had gone inward, not as a decision, not as a strategy she had consciously formulated and chosen to implement, as an adaptation, the most fundamental kind, the kind that happens below the level of conscious thought. In the deep organizational processes of a developing mind that is doing what developing minds do when they encounter problems they need to solve, finding a solution and implementing it and building it into the structure of how things work, so permanently and so completely that the solution eventually becomes indistinguishable from the self. The mind builds itself from what it finds. And what Bella's mind had found in the earliest and most formative years of its construction was an external world that was fully occupied, that had no reliable room for the contents of her own interior, that was organized around needs and priorities and emotional realities that were not hers and could not be made hers without the loss of something essential. The adaptation her mind had made was elegant in its simplicity and total in its execution. And if the exterior cannot hold what belongs to you, you build an interior that can. You build it carefully, and you build it deep, and you build it with walls that are as complete as the pressure that required them, and you keep building across every ordinary day of an ordinary childhood, until the interior is so thoroughly yours, so completely separate from the exterior world's claims upon you, that nothing from the outside can reach it. Not Renee's vivid, generous, overwhelming projection. Not the accumulated pressure of years of being the person in the household who held the household together. Not the particular exhaustion of a childhood spent attending to someone else's emotional world at the continuous expense of your own. Not eventually the telepathic gift of a vampire who had spent a century reading every mind he had ever encountered. Edward sat with this understanding across the long days of Bella's recovery, and across the weeks and months that followed, and felt it settle into the architecture of his theory with the satisfying precision of something that was not only true but inevitable. The kind of understanding that, once reached, made everything that had been puzzling seem obvious in retrospect, made the question seem almost too simple now that the answer was visible. Of course, Bella's mind was silent. Of course, his gift found no surface there, no frequency, no opening of any kind. She had spent the most formative years of her life building an interior that had no external face, that kept its contents without effort or intention, simply because the keeping was structural, because the separation between inside and outside was not something she maintained but something she was. Charlie had given her the disposition, the baseline inclination toward interiority, the constitutional tendency of a mind that did not naturally broadcast, that held its own contents without effort because effort was never required. Renee had given her the pressure, the sustained, daily, foundational necessity of taking that disposition and developing it, of pressing it further and making it stronger, and building it layer upon layer into something that was no longer simply a temperamental tendency, but a complete and permanent and absolutely impenetrable structural feature of a human mind. Together, they had built their daughter into something neither of them had intended, and neither of them would ever fully understand. A mind that kept itself so completely, so automatically, so without any awareness of the keeping, that even the most powerful telepathic gift in the vampire world could find no trace of it. The shield had been built in Phoenix, in the warm and ordinary and loving and spatially overwhelming world that Renee had created without knowing what she was creating. one quiet day at a time, one unremarkable act of interior self-preservation at a time, by a child who was only trying to stay herself in the only way that was available to her, in the space that remained after everything else had been claimed. There is a difference between a choice and an adaptation. This distinction matters enormously when trying to understand what Bella Swan was and how she came to be that way, and why the silence where her mind should have been was not the silence of someone who had decided to be private, or learned to be guarded, or practiced the discipline of withholding over years of conscious effort. A choice can be unmade. A choice leaves traces of its own making, the residue of the decision, the memory of the moment before it was made, the faint but detectable quality of something that was selected from among alternatives and could, under sufficient pressure or changed circumstances, be selected against. An adaptation leaves none of these traces. An adaptation does not remember being made because it was never made in the way that decisions are made. It simply happened. I'm in the deep organizational processes of a developing mind, in the wordless and automatic and entirely unconscious way that minds respond to the environments they find themselves in. Not by choosing a response, but by becoming one. Not by doing something different, but by becoming something different. So gradually and so completely that the becoming is invisible even to the person it is happening to. Bella had not chosen to be unreadable. She had not decided, at any identifiable point across the years of her childhood or adolescence, that she would construct a mental barrier against the world. There had been no moment of intention, no private resolution made in the quiet of her room in Phoenix, no conscious strategy formulated in response to a problem she had recognized and named and decided to address. The shield was not a decision, and it was what had happened to a mind that had been given a specific and sustained and foundational problem to solve, and had solved it the way all minds solve the problems they are given. Below the threshold of awareness, through structural change that accumulated so gradually and so completely across time, that it became eventually simply the way things were, simply the way she was. A feature of her psychology so fundamental and so long established that it was no longer distinguishable from herself. It was not something she had, it was something she was. Understanding how it was built requires going back to the beginning, not to a single moment or a single dramatic cause, but to the earliest layer of construction, the foundation course, laid down in the first years of life when the mind is most plastic, most responsive, and most thoroughly and permanently shaped by what it finds itself embedded in, when the decisions being made at the organizational level are the ones that will last longest and run deepest and prove most resistant across all the years that follow to any kind of revision or dismantling. The earliest layer was the simplest, and in its simplicity the most profound. Before language, before conscious self-awareness, before the cognitive architecture that would later allow Bella to analyze or compare or even fully notice what was particular about the world she had been born into. Before any of this, the mind was already doing what minds do in their earliest stage of development. Learning. Not learning in the deliberate sense of attending to information and storing it. Learning in the most fundamental sense, the pre-verbal, pre-conscious sense of a developing system absorbing the parameters of its environment, building its basic operational assumptions about the nature of the world, constructing constructing from the raw material of daily experience the foundational structures that would govern everything that came after. What Bella's mind learned in those earliest years was a lesson that most children do not learn, or learn only partially, only in specific contexts, only as a conditional rule that applies in some situations, rather than as the general and unremarkable condition of the world as it actually was. She learned that the interior and the exterior were not the same thing, and that this difference was not a problem to be solved, or a gap to be closed, or a developmental milestone to be achieved on the way to full emotional expression. And it was simply a condition to be navigated, a basic and permanent and unchosen feature of the world she inhabited, that what happened inside did not automatically happen outside, that feeling something and transmitting something were separate acts that did not require each other, that could be entirely decoupled without loss or failure, that in her particular world were more often decoupled than connected, because the available space for transmission was already occupied by a presence more powerful and more constant and more thoroughly organized around outward expression than anything her small, developing, still-forming interior could compete with. This was the foundation layer of the shield. Not a wall in any active or constructed sense, not a barrier that had been erected against something, but simply the earliest learned understanding that the inside was its own country, with its own territory and its own climate, and its own complete and sufficient existence, with a border that did not have to be permeable simply because the outside world was pressing against it. The border existed, the inside stayed inside, not because anything was forcing it to stay inside, but because the inside had learned from the beginning that staying inside was the only reliable way to remain itself. Most children learn the opposite orientation, and learn it gradually across the supported and scaffolded process of early development. Most children begin in a state of complete interior-exterior fusion. The feeling and the expression are one thing, simultaneous and automatic and entirely undifferentiated, and the hunger expressed as crying, before the hunger is even consciously registered as hunger. The discomfort broadcast immediately and completely into the surrounding space, because no distinction yet exists between having an experience and communicating that experience to the world. The development of emotional regulation, of the capacity to feel something without immediately and completely externalizing it, to hold an interior state without releasing it into the available space, is a gradual developmental achievement in most children, learned across years and with the active support of caregivers who model and encourage and create the conditions for it. It is not a natural resting state. It is an achieved one, arrived at slowly from the starting point of fusion. For Bella, and the developmental trajectory ran in precisely the opposite direction, and ran with a speed and a thoroughness that reflected the urgency of what had required it. She did not begin in fusion and gradually developed the capacity for separation. She began in an environment where separation was the necessary precondition for maintaining any interior life at all, and her mind, responsive and adaptive in the way that all developing minds are responsive and adaptive, built separation into its structure before she had any conscious understanding of what she was doing or why. Not as a rebellion against fusion, not as a rejection of connection, but as the only available solution to a problem that existed before she had the cognitive tools to recognize it as a problem. The environment required it. The mind provided it, and the structure was laid before the child who inhabited it had any capacity to observe it being laid. The second layer came with language, with the gradual emergence of conscious self-awareness, with the development of the cognitive tools that allowed a child to begin constructing a more complex and differentiated relationship with her own interior experience. This was the stage at which the adaptation began to take on the particular character that would later distinguish Bella so completely from the people around her. The extraordinary outward attunement combined with the near total inward opacity, the capacity to receive that existed in the most complete possible contrast to the near absence of any capacity to transmit. This was the stage at which she began to become, in the most fundamental and consequential sense, as a receiver rather than a transmitter. The skill the environment required at this stage was reading, specifically the reading of Renee, of the particular emotional weather system that was the primary atmospheric condition of Bella's world, with all its patterns and cycles and the specific advance indicators that distinguished one kind of incoming weather from another. The particular quality of Renee's voice when things were about to shift. The specific energy in the apartment that preceded one of her enthusiasms, vivid and consuming and temporarily reorganizing everything around it, versus the different energy that preceded one of her quieter periods, when the outward projection dimmed slightly and the household could breathe at a different rate for a while. The various subtle signals that allowed Bella to anticipate what was coming before it arrived, to position herself appropriately, to have already made whatever adjustment the changing conditions required before the requirement was explicitly stated. She became extraordinarily good at this, genuinely, remarkably, in ways that went far beyond what could be attributed to ordinary childhood attentiveness or the natural development of social awareness. She became good at it the way people become good at things they practice continuously from the earliest age under conditions that make proficiency a matter of daily necessity, with a fluency so complete that the skill ceased to feel like a skill and simply felt like the natural texture of experience, the way the world simply was, where the obvious and unremarkable way that one moved through any environment populated by other people. By the time Bella was old enough to have the metacognitive capacity to observe her own patterns, the attunement was already fully operational and entirely automatic. She read rooms before she entered them. She read faces before their owners had completed the expressions she was already interpreting. She tracked the emotional arc of a conversation across its entire duration, always aware of where things were heading, always already positioned to respond to where things were heading before they arrived at the destination she had anticipated. And none of this continuously operating, extraordinarily precise, entirely automatic outward-facing attunement required any corresponding outward movement on her own part. It could not require it, because the architecture had been designed from the beginning around the principle of unidirectional flow. She received. She did not send. She understood. She did not reveal, because revealing would have meant opening the interior to the exterior, and the interior was the only territory that was genuinely and completely hers, and the protection of that territory had been the organizing principle of her psychological development, since before she had any words for protection or territory, or the distinction between the self and the world that surrounds it. This was the paradox that Edward had found so genuinely disorienting in the early weeks of knowing her, as so endlessly and productively fascinating. The quality that had first made him understand that what he was dealing with was not simply a quiet person or a private person, or a person who happened not to be thinking very loudly on any given day. Bella was among the most perceptive people he had ever encountered, assessed by the standards of someone who had encountered thousands of people across a century of existence and had access to their interior lives with an intimacy and a comprehensiveness that no human observer could approach. Her ability to read emotional subtext, to understand what was happening beneath the surface of a conversation, to know what people needed before they had articulated the need even to themselves. This was genuine and extraordinary and consistently present across every interaction he had observed her in. And yet she was, simultaneously, and without any apparent contradiction or discomfort, the single most opaque person he had ever encountered. The asymmetry was so complete that it initially seemed paradoxical, seemed to require an explanation beyond the simple observation of the fact. But the asymmetry was not a paradox. It was the design. It was precisely and exactly what the adaptation had built, because the adaptation had never been about balance, had never been about achieving any equitable relationship between what came in and what went out. It had been about protecting the interior by ensuring that the flow moved in one direction only, and it had achieved this so completely that the one directionality had become the person, had become Bella. The third layer arrived in adolescence, and this was perhaps the most critical stage in the shield's development. The stage at which the distinction between process and property was finally crossed, at which the thing that had been an active and developing and continuously refined coping strategy hardened into something of a fundamentally different order, something that no longer required maintenance, something that no longer operated through the continuous and renewable exertion of any form of effort or intention, something that had become, in the most complete and permanent sense available within the constraints of human psychology, simply what she was. This distinction between a practice capability and a constitutive property mattered in ways that Edward had come to understand were absolutely central to explaining why his gift found no surface in her at all. A practice can be interrupted. A practice can be overwhelmed by circumstances extreme enough to disrupt the conditions under which it normally operates. By exhaustion, by crisis, by the simple accumulated pressure of sustained exposure to conditions that exceed the ordinary demands the practice was designed to meet. A practice has moments of weakness, moments of leakage, moments when the thing being maintained through effort slips because the effort is temporarily unavailable. A property has none of these vulnerabilities. A property does not depend on effort because it does not operate through effort. It is not maintained. It simply is. And what simply is cannot be disrupted because there is no mechanism of maintenance to disrupt, no effort to overwhelm, no moment of weakness to exploit. When the shield crossed from practiced adaptation to constitutive property, and Edward believed, from everything he had observed about Bella's psychological structure, that this crossing had happened gradually across the middle years of her adolescence, As the accumulated weight of years of consistent structural reinforcement had finally achieved a kind of critical mass beyond which the structure became self-sustaining, it became for the first time something that could not be reached by any external force, regardless of the power or sophistication of that force. Not because it was being actively defended, because it had no external face to attack. The exterior of Bella's mind simply did not exist, had never existed in any form that could be accessed from the outside. The shield was not a wall between the interior and the exterior. It was the complete absence of an exterior, the inside and only the inside, all the way down. The evidence for this consolidation was visible, quietly and consistently, in everything Edward had assembled about Bella's life in Phoenix. Her social footprint had been small, not from shyness or unfriendliness, or any of the qualities that typically produce social smallness in adolescence, not from a lack of warmth or the capacity for genuine care. She had been liked. She had been sought out by people who sensed in her a quality of attentiveness and genuine interest that was rarer than they knew how to articulate. But she had not been close to anyone, in the specific and demanding sense that genuine closeness requires. The mutual disclosure, the reciprocal access, and the particular vulnerability of allowing another person to know your interior the way you know theirs. She had been present and warm and consistently generous with her attention and her care. She had not been known, and she had not experienced this as a loss, which was itself significant. Most people who are not known feel the absence of being known as a specific and identifiable lack, a loneliness that has a particular shape, a hunger for the kind of connection that requires being seen. Bella did not seem to feel this, not because she was cold or self-sufficient in some armored, defended way, but because the interior that might have experienced the lack of being known was so thoroughly organized around its own self-containment that the need for external knowing had never fully developed, as she was complete inside herself in a way that was unusual and faintly puzzling to the people around her who sensed it without being able to name it. A quality of not needing anything that sat oddly alongside her evident warmth and her genuine care for others. She gave. She did not need to receive, not in the form of being known, not in the form of access, not in the form of any opening of the interior to an exterior presence. This completeness was the third layer of the shield in its most mature and consolidated form, and it had a shadow side that Edward had spent considerable time attending to, because the shadow side was, in its way, as revealing as the shield itself, a mind that has organized itself around not externalizing, that has spent the critical years of its development building and reinforcing and finally consolidating the principle that the interior stays interior, becomes, over time, a mind that is also somewhat opaque to itself, not entirely, not in a way that produced dysfunction or the kind of radical disconnection from one's own experience that characterized genuine psychological fragmentation, but in a specific and consistent way that was visible in Bella's particular relationship with her own emotional life. The capacity for self-knowledge, for genuine, articulate, fully formed understanding of one's own interior states and motivations and desires, depends partly on the same processes that produce external expression. When we put something into words, even internal words, and even the entirely private language of our own thinking, we are performing a translation from one form of experience to another, We are taking something that exists in the pre-verbal, pre-articular register of raw feeling or impulse or sensation, and giving it shape and boundary and definition. And this translation is itself a form of clarification. It makes a thing more legible, not to anyone outside, but to the person doing the translating. It is how we know what we feel with any precision. It is how we understand our own motivations clearly enough to examine them. It is how we locate ourselves within our own experience with the kind of specificity that allows for genuine self-knowledge, rather than the broad impressionistic awareness of one's own existence that everyone possesses without effort. A mind that has become profoundly skilled at not performing this translation outward, that has organized itself across the years of its development around the principle that interior contents do not travel outward into articulable form, loses gradually, and without particularly noticing the loss, some of its facility with the translation inward as well. The same structural organization that prevented Bella's interior from reaching Edward's gift also created within the interior itself a slight but consistent distance between the raw experience of her own emotional life and her capacity to examine that experience with the clarity and precision that full self-knowledge requires. She understood herself in fragments, in images and impulses, and the accumulated evidence of her own behavior observed from a slight remove, as if she were watching herself from a position just outside her own experience. She knew what she had done more readily than she knew why. She knew what she felt in the broad and certain strokes of the feeling itself. The love was unmistakable. The fear was unmistakable. The stubborn and absolute quality of her commitment to the people and the choices that mattered to her was unmistakable. Without always being able to articulate the specific shape or source or precise quality of these things, in the way that people who have spent their lives externalizing their interior lives generally can. She moved through her own emotional experience with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had long since made peace with navigating in partial light. This too was the shield. Not only the barrier between her interior and the exterior world, but the particular relationship the barrier had created between Bella and her own depths. The architecture of protection had extended, inevitably and without intention, to shape her relationship with the interior it was protecting. It had kept herself intact across a childhood that might otherwise have absorbed that self into a more powerful field. And it had done so at the cost of a certain transparency, not to others, but to herself. A certain willingness to remain partially unknown even in the country of her own experience. And through all of it, through every layer of construction, every stage of consolidation, every intended and unintended consequence of the long and unannounced work of building a self under pressure, the shield had never been visible, not to Renee, who loved Bella with complete sincerity and had never had any awareness that there was a self being so carefully maintained at a distance from her own expansive field. Not to Charlie, who recognized in his daughter a quietness that rhymed with his own and accepted it as the family character, without ever wondering what it had cost or what had built it. Not to Bella herself, who inhabited the structure without being able to see it, who was the thing she had built so thoroughly that the building and the built were one. It would take someone who had spent a century on the outside of human minds, someone who knew exactly what a mind felt like when it reached toward his gift, and what it felt like, the specific, extraordinary, utterly unprecedented quality of what it felt like when one did not, and the shield had been built in the most ordinary circumstances available, by the most ordinary process that a developing human mind possesses, one unremarkable day at a time, by a child who is only doing what children do when the world requires it of them. She had stayed herself. And in staying herself, in the quiet and unwitnessed and entirely unconscious act of keeping the interior intact across the years of a childhood that had no room for it anywhere else, she'd built, without knowing it, the most impenetrable thing in the world she was about to enter. The date was January 17th, a Monday, and the kind of Fawkes morning that was indistinguishable from every other Fawkes morning in the long grey succession of them that Edward had endured across 2 years of choosing this particular location for its cloud cover and its rain and its reliable absence of the sunlight that would have made their presence here impossible. He had woken, in the technical sense that vampires wake, returning from the meditative stillness that passed for rest in their kind, awareness reassembling itself from quiet into the full and immediate alertness that was simply the baseline state of a vampire consciousness, and had begun the familiar performance of a school day, the drive, the parking lot, the corridors of a building whose layout he had memorized within the first week, and whose social dynamics he had mapped within the first month, because mapping was automatic, and memorization was simply what happened when you had a mind that had never once, in a century of continuous operation, been given the relief of forgetting anything. He had not expected anything from that Monday. He had not expected anything from any Monday in Fawkes, because Fawkes had proven, across 2 years of residence, to be a place where the absence of the unexpected was the most reliable feature of daily life. The students thought the same thoughts they had been thinking since September. The teachers followed curricula that Edward had encountered in various forms across 2 decades of cyclical high school attendance. The social dynamic shifted in the small, predictable ways that small-town adolescent social dynamic shifted, governed by forces too familiar to generate any genuine surprise. He had settled into the particular variety of numb endurance that Fawkes required of him, and he had expected Monday the 17th to be another unremarkable unit in the long procession of unremarkable units that constituted his existence in this place. Then the door to the biology classroom opened, and 2 things happened simultaneously, and nothing was the same afterward. The first thing was the scent. He had written about this extensively in his own private accounting of the event, had turned it over in his mind so many times across the weeks and months that followed that he could reconstruct it with a precision that was itself a form of torment. It hit him the way that nothing had hit him in decades, not gradually, not as a building awareness, but all at once, complete and overwhelming, a sensory event so total that it temporarily reorganized the hierarchy of everything else he was experiencing, pushing the background noise of 30 other human minds to the periphery and filling the foreground with a single consuming, unbearable fact. Her blood, the specific and particular and entirely personal call of her blood to the predator that lived beneath everything else he was, that had been living there for a century without ever being addressed this directly, this specifically, this devastatingly. He had managed it. Barely, and at a cost he would not fully account for until much later. But he had managed it. He had stopped breathing, had turned his face away, and had focused every available resource on the single task of remaining in his seat, rather than doing what every instinct he possessed was demanding with an urgency he had no prior experience of. And in the midst of this crisis, in the middle of what was genuinely the most immediate and overwhelming test of his control in decades of careful, sustained daily discipline, in the middle of all of this, the second thing happened. He reached for her mind. As he reached for every mind in every room he entered, automatically and without decision, the reflex of a century, it was not a conscious act. It was simply what he did, as automatic as the assessment of physical threat that happened simultaneously in every new environment, as involuntary as the continuous low-level monitoring of every heartbeat and breathing pattern within his range. He reached for her mind the way he always reached, with a particular quality of receptive attention that his gift operated through, the opening toward another consciousness that was as natural and as unremarkable to him as opening his eyes, and found nothing. Not the quiet signal of a mind he couldn't quite tune into. Not the muffled, softened quality of a consciousness that was simply less loud than others, that required closer attention to receive clearly. Not the blurred or fragmented quality of a mind in some unusual state, sleeping, or in severe distress, or altered by illness or substances in ways that sometimes change the quality of the signal he received without eliminating it. Nothing. The complete and total and absolutely unambiguous absence of any signal at all. He reached toward the location in the room where she existed, where her body was, where her heartbeat was, where the scent that was destroying his concentration was originating, and encountered, in the space where her mind should have been broadcasting with the same involuntary generosity as every other human mind in his experience, a silence so complete that it had its own quality, its own presence, the presence of an absence so total that it was experienced not as nothing, but as something, as a specific and extraordinary and entirely unprecedented feature of the environment, as real and as unmistakable as any positive signal he had ever received. Two crises at once, the blood and the silence. And they were not equivalent crises. The blood was immediate, physical, dangerous in the most direct and urgent sense, unthreatening the safety of everyone in the room in a way that required his complete and ongoing attention. But the silence was different. The silence was the kind of crisis that does not announce itself as a crisis at all, that presents itself initially as a curiosity, a puzzle, an anomaly that requires explanation rather than a threat that requires management. It was the kind of thing that could be set aside in the moment, filed for later consideration, acknowledged, and then bracketed, while more urgent matters demanded attention. He could not set it aside. That was what he discovered in the hours and days that followed, and across the endless biology classes, and the cafeteria observations, and the long sleepless nights in his room, where the question had taken up residence with a particular tenacity of something that intended to stay. The silence was not settable aside. It had lodged itself in his attention with the same thoroughness and the same apparent permanence as her scent had lodged itself in his memory. Indelible, always present at some level regardless of what else was occupying his consciousness, returning to the foreground the moment his attention was not actively directed elsewhere. to understand why. It is necessary to understand what his existence actually felt like from the inside, what it meant in the concrete experiential sense. To be a mind that received other minds the way he did, not as a skill he exercised or an ability he deployed, but as the fundamental condition of his consciousness, the basic atmospheric fact of being Edward Cullen in any environment that contained other people. The thoughts of those around him arrived constantly. This was not a figure of speech or an approximation. Constantly, without pause, without intermission, without the natural rhythms of attention that allowed human consciousness to rest between inputs. The way human ears receive sound continuously, but attend to it selectively, filtering most of it to background awareness and attending consciously only to what is relevant or unexpected. His gift did not filter. It received. The interior lives of everyone within his range existed in his consciousness with the same immediacy and the same involuntary presence as his own thoughts, layered over each other in the continuous, simultaneous, never-ending cacophony of other people's mental lives pressing against the inside of his own mind. He had developed strategies across the century. He had learned to push most of it to a kind of managed background awareness. Present, always present, but not requiring the full attention he had spent his earliest vampire years giving it before he understood that giving it full attention was the path toward a particular kind of madness. He had learned to tune down the volume without eliminating the signal, to maintain the ambient awareness without being consumed by it, to exist in the presence of other minds without being obliterated by them. It was a skill that had taken decades to develop and required continuous maintenance, and was never, not once in 100 years, fully successful. The thoughts were always there. The noise was always there. The fundamental privacy that human beings experience as simply the default condition of their own consciousness. The basic and unremarkable fact of being the only occupant of one's own mind was something Edward hadn't experienced since the morning of his transformation, when his gift had first manifested and the silence of his own interior had been permanently colonized by the consciousness of everyone around him. This was the context in which Bella's silence arrived. This was the landscape against which it needed to be understood. Not the silence of a quiet room, which still has the ambient sounds of a building and the muffled noise of the world outside. Nor the silence of a forest in the early morning, before the human world has begun its daily noise. The silence of Bella Swan's mind, and the landscape of Edward's particular consciousness, was the silence of the only thing that had ever simply not been there. In a world of constant, involuntary, inescapable signal, in a century of never once being alone in his own mind, she was the only location in the entire landscape that produced nothing. Not a quieter signal, not a softer frequency, nothing. He had not known, until he encountered it, that this was possible. He had not known, because there had been no evidence across a century of experience to suggest it, that a human mind could exist in his range without producing any signal at all. He had assumed, not as a conscious theoretical position, but as the embedded assumption of lived experience, that all minds broadcast, and that the variation was in the character and volume of the broadcast, not in whether the broadcast occurred. Bella had disproved this assumption on a Monday morning in January, and the disproof had been so complete and so immediate, and so utterly without gradation that he had not been able to process it in the moment. He had simply experienced the nothing, alongside the overwhelming everything of her scent, and had filed it in the part of his mind reserved for things that required explanation he could not yet provide. The filing did not hold. The question returned compulsively and repeatedly throughout the days that followed. He found himself checking, an automatic, reflexive, embarrassingly compulsive habit that he noticed within the first week and could not stop. Every few minutes in the biology classroom, his awareness would sweep toward the location where she sat, reaching for the mind that should have been there, finding the same absence, registering the absence with the same faint shock of the unexpected, even though the unexpected had by now become entirely predictable. He was checking the way a person checks a wound, not because they expect it to have changed, but because the checking itself is a response to the reality of the wound, a way of confirming that the unusual thing is still unusual, that the experience is real and not an anomaly that will resolve itself without explanation. What he learned about the shield during those early weeks, by studying the specific quality and extent of the absence, rather than simply experiencing it, told him things that mattered for the theory he was beginning, almost without deciding to construct, because he could hear the minds of everyone around Bella. He could map the shield's edges with a precision that no one who lacked his gift could have achieved. He heard Jessica's thoughts about her. He heard Mike Newton's thoughts about her, in volumes, and with a specificity that Edward found alternately irritating and instructive. He heard Angela Weber's genuine warmth, Lauren Mallory's calculated coolness, the various and overlapping assessments of every student who had formed an opinion about the new girl from Phoenix. All of it reached him clearly and completely. Every thought directed toward Bella, every mental image of her, every assessment and fantasy and piece of social calculation that involved her as a subject. None of it reached him from her. The shield had a precise perimeter. It covered exactly the space Bella occupied. It extended no further and was absolute within that space. He could hear people thinking about her from outside the shield. He could not hear her thinking about anything from inside it. The boundary was not gradual or fuzzy, or subject to variation depending on his distance from her or the intensity of his focus. It was exact. It was constant. It was as clearly defined and as completely maintained as any physical boundary he had ever encountered. More clearly defined in some ways, because physical boundaries have edges that can be probed and tested and eventually mapped with sufficient effort. The shield's edge simply was. There was signal on one side of it and nothing on the other, and the transition between the two was not a gradient, but an absolute. He watched her across the weeks of their careful, incremental, increasingly complicated acquaintance, and gathered the information about her that her mind refused to provide through the only channels available to him: observation, inference, the reading of her body's involuntary signals with the inhuman precision that his senses allowed. Her heartbeat was legible to him in ways she could not have imagined. He learned, across the weeks, the specific rhythm of her heart at baseline and the particular accelerations that corresponded to different emotional states. The quick, light flutter of embarrassment, distinguishable from the heavier, more sustained acceleration of fear, or the different quality of acceleration that he was increasingly reluctant to name but could not stop noticing. Her breathing was legible. The temperature changes in her skin were legible. The micro-expressions that crossed her face in the fractions of a second before she composed her expression into something more controlled were legible to eyes that processed visual information at a speed no human observer could match. He was building a portrait of her interior life from biological data, because biological data was the only data she produced that his gift could access. And the portrait was partial, always missing the thing that every other portrait he had ever built contained as its most central and most revealing element. He knew what her body was doing. He did not know what she was thinking. He knew how she felt, in the broad, physiological sense of feeling. He did not know what she thought about what she felt, or what she made of it, or what she would choose to do with it. And the difference between those two things was the difference between observing a person from outside a window and actually knowing them. And for the first time in a century, he was on the outside of the window. The effect of this on his interior experience was something he had not anticipated and could not have predicted, because it had no precedent in his existence. He had expected the inability to read her mind to be simply frustrating. The absence of information he was accustomed to having, a gap in the data that his analytical mind would find uncomfortable and would continuously attempt to fill through other means. This was part of it. The frustration was real, and the compulsive checking was his behavioral expression, and the increasingly elaborate attempts to read her through biological signals rather than mental ones were its cognitive expression. But underneath the frustration, and more powerful than it, and more consequential than he was willing to fully acknowledge in the early weeks, was something else entirely. Something he did not have a ready word for, because the experience it was responding to was one he had no prior exposure to. When he was near Bella, in the biology classroom beside her, in the cafeteria across the room from her, on the evenings when he had permitted himself the particular transgression of watching over her from outside her window, the noise was different, not gone. The other minds in the environment continued to produce their constant and involuntary signal. It continued to reach his gift with the same indiscriminate generosity as always. But in the space where she was, the space that she occupied in the landscape of his consciousness, there was the silence. And the silence, surrounded by noise, was itself a kind of sound, a presence, a place in the mental landscape that was simply, completely, restfully quiet. He craved it. This was the truth he was slowest to arrive at and most reluctant to fully acknowledge, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging something about his own need that he had not previously known was there. He craved the silence the way a person craves sleep after long sleeplessness. Not because sleep is in itself extraordinary, but because the state it relieves is unbearable, and the relief is therefore experienced as profound beyond its objective qualities. Or he had been sleepless, in this particular sense, for a century. He had not known he was sleepless because he had never experienced the alternative. Bella was the alternative. Bella was what it felt like, in the one location in the mental landscape that she occupied, to simply not be receiving, to simply be, for a few square feet of space, alone in his own mind. This was the thing the shield gave him that he had never expected and could not have asked for. because he had not known it was a thing that could be given. Not information, not understanding, not access to the mystery of her interior, which remained as complete and as impenetrable across the months of their growing closeness as it had been on that first Monday morning. Simply quiet, simply the extraordinary, unprecedented, entirely accidental gift of a space in the world where his gift found nothing, and the finding of nothing was the most profound something he had experienced in 100 years. The shield's quality remained absolutely constant across every circumstance he observed her in. When she was frightened in Port Angeles, the darkness of her terror reaching him through every physiological signal available, the shield did not weaken. When she was overwhelmed in the meadow, processing the revelation of what he was with a courage that moved him beyond his capacity to fully articulate, the shield did not slip. When she slept, when the conscious mind relaxed its daytime organization, and the dreaming mind moved through its own unconstrained territories, the shield did not relax with it, and he could hear her murmur his name in her sleep, could hear the sound of it, the particular quality of how she said it in the unguarded state of dreaming, and still could not hear a single word of what accompanied the name in the dream itself. The shield was as complete in her sleeping mind as in her waking one, as complete in crisis as in calm, as complete at the moment of greatest emotional intensity as in the most ordinary moments of daily routine. This consistency was the final and most important piece of information the shield communicated to him about its own nature, because inconsistency was the signature of effort. Anything maintained through conscious or unconscious exertion showed variation across the conditions of its maintenance, was stronger when the conditions were favorable, and weaker when they were not. You held more firmly when the person was rested and alert, and less firmly when they were exhausted or overwhelmed, or simply not attending to the thing that required their attention. The shield showed no such variation across every emotional state, every level of stress, every condition of waking and sleeping and crisis and calm. It remained exactly what it had been on the first day. Perfect, complete, effortless in the only sense that truly mattered. Not the sense of being easy, but the sense of requiring no effort at all, because it was not a thing being done, but a thing that simply was. A property, not a practice, not a skill, not a defense being maintained against him or against anything else. Simply the way Bella Swan's mind was organized at the most fundamental level, in its most basic and permanent and constitutive structure. She did not choose this silence any more than she chose the color of her eyes. It was not something she was doing. It was something she was. And Edward, sitting in the quiet that she carried with her into every room she entered, in the one location in his mental landscape that had ever simply been still, understood that the shield was not a gift that had been given to her. It was a home that she had built, and she had built it, brick by ordinary brick, across the unremarkable years of a childhood that had required it of her, in the only way that the most permanent and the most real things are ever built, without knowing she was building, without knowing until someone came along who could read the architecture from the outside, that what she had made was anything other than simply herself. The transformation lasted 3 days, and this was the standard duration, the biological constant of the process that Carlyle had explained to Edward in those first bewildered hours after his own change. the fixed interval during which the venom worked its systematic and irreversible rewriting of every cellular structure in the human body. 3 days of fire. 3 days during which the person who had existed before, the particular and irreplaceable arrangement of biology and memory, and accumulated experience, and the specific psychological structures built across a lifetime of being a specific human being, was simultaneously destroyed and preserved, unmade and remade. The human version of the self burned away so completely that nothing of its fragile mortal architecture remained. While something deeper and more permanent than biology was held intact through the fire and emerged on the other side, translated into a form that would last forever. Edward had not been present for the beginning of Bella's transformation. The circumstances had not permitted it, and the specific weight of not having been there, of having been separated from her during the hours when she was most completely vulnerable, most completely without the resources to manage what was happening to her, was something he had carried across the days of waiting with a grim and helpless attention that he suspected would leave its own mark on him. Permanent in the way that the worst hours always left their mark regardless of how completely the crisis they belonged to was eventually resolved. But he had been there for the end of it, had been in the room and positioned close enough to hear the specific changes in her heartbeat as it moved through the final stages of the process. The gradual, then rapid, then absolute slowing that marked the transformation's completion. The last few beats of a heart that had been beating for nearly 18 years, carrying their particular and unrepeatable human rhythm. And then the silence, the complete and final and permanent silence of a heart that had stopped and would not start again, and did not need to. And in the moment after that silence, in the first seconds of the new reality that followed the last beat of Bella Swan's human heart, Edward had done what he had been waiting, across the entire 3 days of the transformation, to do. He had reached for her mind. He had told himself, across those 3 days, not to expect anything different. He had told himself, with the careful rationality of someone who understood the theory he had constructed and understood its implications, that the shield would survive the transformation, that the structural feature of her psychology that had produced it was not the kind of thing the venom destroyed. The venom destroyed fragility, it destroyed mortality, it destroyed the biological limitations that kept human capabilities within human ranges. It did not destroy the fundamental organization of a consciousness, the deep structural architecture that made a person who they were rather than simply what they were. The shield was not a human limitation. It was a human achievement, and achievements, the theory suggested, were precisely what the transformation preserved and amplified rather than eliminated. He knew all of this. He had reasoned through it carefully and had arrived at a confident conclusion. And still, in the moment after her heart stopped, when he reached for her mind with the reflexive, involuntary, century-deep habit of his gift, he had hoped, had allowed himself, in the irrational and unkillable way that hope operates regardless of the quality of the reasoning arrayed against it, to imagine that the transformation might have changed something, that the fire might have opened something, that on the other side of 3 days of absolute biological remaking, the silence might have resolved into something he could hear. It had not. The silence that greeted his gift in the moment after Bella's transformation was complete was the same silence that had greeted it on a Monday morning in January in a biology classroom in Forks. The same in the sense of being absolute. The same in the sense of being effortless, producing no sensation of effort or maintenance or active defense, simply the clean and total absence of any outward-facing surface for his gift to encounter. But different in a way that was immediately and unmistakably legible to someone who had spent months studying the specific quality of her human silence and had learned to read its texture with the precision that only sustained and intimate familiarity produces. The human silence had warmth in it, not the warmth of signal. There had never been signal, not once, not a fragment, but the warmth of proximity to a living body, the ambient biological warmth of a heartbeat and breath, and the million small physiological processes that constituted the background hum of human existence. The human silence was surrounded by all of this, embedded in it, inseparable from the overall sensory presence of a living person, whose biology was constantly broadcasting even when her mind was not. It was a silence within a context, a stillness at the center of an ongoing biological event. The vampire's silence was crystalline. It was the silence of something that had been refined to its essential nature, stripped of everything surrounding and secondary and contingent, left as purely and completely itself as the process of transformation could make it. There was no longer any biological warmth to provide context. There was no heartbeat, no breath, no ambient hum of ongoing physiological process. There was only the shield itself, in its pure and permanent and absolute form. The structure without the surrounding, the architecture without the scaffolding, the thing itself without any of the mortal trappings that had previously accompanied it. It was the difference between a diamond embedded in rock and a diamond held in open air. The diamond had always been there. The transformation had simply removed everything that was not the diamond. Edward sat with this for a long moment, the recognition of it, the understanding of what he was experiencing, and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since the night he had first reached for her mind and found nothing. Not resolution exactly, because the silence was still silence. She was still inaccessible to him in the way she had always been inaccessible. The fundamental asymmetry of their relationship was not altered by the transformation, but a kind of completion, the theory he had been building across the months of knowing her, across the careful accumulation of observation and inference, and the slow, painstaking work of tracing the shield backward through her history to its origin in Charlie's constitutional quietness and Renee's overwhelming projection, and the long, unwitnessed, entirely unconscious work of a child protecting her own interior across a childhood that had required that protection. The theory had arrived at its end point. The shield was not a gift conferred by transformation. It was a structure perfected by it, the most complete and permanent and powerful version of something that had always been there, always been real, always been the defining feature of a mind that had built itself around the single organizing principle of interior inviolability. The capabilities of the vampire shield, mapped against the specific powers it encountered in the months and years that followed the transformation, told their own story about the completeness of what had been amplified. Edward's telepathy found nothing, as it had always found nothing, but the quality of the nothing was now such that even Aro, whose gift was a vastly more comprehensive version of Edward's own, capable of reading not just present thoughts, but the entire accumulated history of a mind's experience through a single touch, found the same absolute wall. Jane's gift, which operated by projecting the illusion of pain directly into the minds of its targets, and which had never, in Edward's experience or in the collective experience of the Volturi who wielded her, encountered a mind it could not reach, found nothing in Bella. Alec's gift, which worked by severing the connection between a target's mind and their physical senses, cutting them off from all external input and leaving them isolated inside a consciousness that could no longer perceive anything beyond itself, found no purchase, no entry point, no mechanism through which the severance could be initiated. The shield did not deflect these powers. It simply did not present them with any surface against which they could operate. They reached toward it and found the same thing Edward's gift found. The crystalline, perfect, effortless nothing of a mind that had no exterior face. But it was the extension of the shield outward, the development of Bella's ability to project her protection beyond herself, to cover others within its perimeter, to make the absolute defense of her own interior available to the people she chose to include, that Edward found most theoretically significant, most revealing about what the shield actually was and where it had actually come from. In its human form, the shield had been entirely interior. Its purpose, the purpose it had been built to serve across the years of Bella's childhood, was the protection of a single interior, her own. It covered her and nothing beyond her, because the problem it had been solving was the problem of her own self-preservation in the face of an overwhelming external field. And that problem had a scope of exactly one child needing to remain herself, one developing mind requiring protection for its own content. The shield, built to solve that problem, was precisely as large as the problem required, no larger. And the vampire amplification did not simply make the shield stronger. It made it larger in the specific way that corresponded to the amplification of everything else that had survived the transformation intact. Not just the feature itself, but the underlying capacity from which the feature had grown. The underlying capacity, in Bella's case, was not simply the ability to protect her own interior. It was the impulse toward protection that had driven the shield's construction in the first place. The instinct, born in a child who had spent her formative years being the one who managed and absorbed and accommodated, who had learned before she could name the learning that taking care was what she did, what she was, the primary mode of her relationship with the people she loved, toward extending protection outward, toward covering others, toward being, for the people in her world, the thing she had always been for herself, the one who held things safe when the external world pressed too hard. The transformation amplified this impulse alongside the shield itself, made it operable in the literal, practical, supernatural sense, so that the protection Bella had spent her childhood building for her own interior became, in its vampire form, something she could choose to extend outward, could physically project beyond herself, could wrap around the people she loved with the same completeness and the same impenetrability that it had always covered her own mind. The child who had learned to protect herself had become, through the amplification of the transformation, someone who could protect everyone. The parallel was not subtle, and Edward did not miss it, and the role had not changed. She had always been the one who absorbed the pressure, who managed the field, who made it possible for the people around her to exist more comfortably by doing the quiet, invisible work of maintaining the conditions that allowed for comfort. She had done this for Renee across 17 years of childhood, absorbing her mother's overwhelming projection so that Renee could exist in the expansive, generous, entirely unconscious way that was natural to her. She did it now for her family, extending her shield over them in the moments when the powers of their enemies reached toward them, absorbing the attack into the absolute silence of her own inviolable interior, so that the people she loved could exist safely on the other side of it. The tools were different. The impulse was identical. The transformation had not changed who she was. It had given her the power to be who she was, at the scale the world she now inhabited required. Renesmee was born approximately 9 months after Bella's transformation began. In the biological sense, the pregnancy having proceeded at a rate that defied every parameter of normal human gestation, compressing into the span of a few months, a process that would ordinarily require 9, driven by the hybrid biology that was entirely without precedent in any experience Edward or Carlyle or anyone in their extended knowledge of the vampire world had ever encountered. She arrived, in every sense, as something new. Not vampire, not human, are not the simple combination of the two, but something genuinely third. A being whose existence represented a biological possibility that no one had previously known existed, whose development and capabilities and the specific character of her emerging gifts would require entirely new frameworks to understand. Her gift manifested almost immediately. Before she had language, before she had the cognitive architecture for conscious communication, she was already reaching, pressing her small hand to the faces of the people around her and transmitting, with a clarity and a completeness that was immediately and unmistakably legible to everyone she touched, the contents of her interior, images, feelings, the specific sensory texture of her moment-to-moment experience, offered directly and without mediation to whoever she chose to share it with. She did not speak her thoughts, she gave them. She placed them directly into the minds of others with the same effortless, natural, automatic quality that characterized every genuine gift. Not a skill being exercised, but a property expressing itself. Not something she was doing, but something she was. The immediate and obvious paradox that Renesmee's gift presented in the context of the theory Edward had constructed around Bella's shield was not lost on him. He sat with it for some time. The apparent contradiction of a mother whose mind was absolutely impenetrable and a daughter whose primary mode of communication was direct mental transmission. A shield that blocked everything and a gift that bypassed everything. These seemed, on first examination, to be directly contradictory. It too suggests that the powers running through this particular family were not in fact the coherent lineage the theory proposed, but simply the random variation that characterized vampire gifts generally, unpredictable, individual, bearing no necessary relationship to the gifts of other family members. The resolution, when it arrived, was not complicated. It was simply a matter of looking at the full picture rather than only the most immediately visible contrast. From Edward, Renesmee had inherited the fundamental orientation of her gift toward mental connection, the reaching toward other minds, the operation in the medium of thought and interior experience, the gift that existed at the interface between one consciousness and another. Edward's gift reached into other minds, how receiving what was there without the other mind's participation or consent. Renesmee's gift reached outward from her own mind, transmitting what was there to other minds with their full and willing participation. The direction was reversed. The medium was identical. The gift was a reflection of his, operating in the opposite direction across the same interface. From Renee, from Bella's mother, who was Renesmee's maternal grandmother, whose extraordinary and entirely unconscious outward projection had been the environmental pressure that had built the shield in the first place. Renesmee had inherited the quality of that projection, the reaching outward, the natural, powerful, entirely genuine impulse to make the interior available to the exterior, to share what was inside with the world outside, and to close the distance between her own experience and the experience of the people she loved by the most direct means available. Renee had done this involuntarily and without precision, flooding the space around her with the contents of her interior without control or awareness, or the ability to choose what was shared and with whom. Renesmee did it with perfect control and perfect precision and perfect choice. The same impulse, refined across a generation and 2 supernatural inheritances into something voluntary and beautiful. And from Bella, from the shield itself, from the absolute and impenetrable inwardness that was her most fundamental characteristic. Renesmee had inherited the inversion. She had been born behind the shield, had spent the compressed months of her gestation inside the most complete mental protection in the vampire world, had developed her consciousness in an environment of absolute interior privacy, had known from the first moments of her extraordinary awareness what it was to exist in a space where nothing from outside could reach her. The shield had been her first world, and her gift was the gift of someone who had always known from the inside what it meant to have a self that was completely and inviolably one's own, and who had developed in response to that knowledge the ability to choose to share it, not to have it taken, not to have it invaded, to give it freely to the people she loved. This was not a contradiction of Bella's shield. It was its completion. The shield had been built by a child who had no choice about the protection, who had built it because the alternative was dissolution, who had sealed the interior because the exterior offered no safe space for it. Renesmee had been born with the protection already in place, had never needed to build it, had never experienced the threat that had made it necessary. And from that position of complete and original safety, she had developed the capacity to do what Bella had never been able to do, to reach outward, voluntarily, from the inviolable interior, and offer its contents as a gift, rather than guarding them as a necessity. The progression across 3 generations was legible once you knew how to read it. Renee, involuntary, powerful, uncontrolled projection, the raw and unconscious form of outward mental transmission. And Bella, involuntary, total, perfectly refined interiority, the raw and amplified form of inward mental containment. Renesmee, voluntary, precise, completely controlled transmission and reception, the synthesis of both, the conscious mastery of the interface that her mother had sealed and her grandmother had flooded without awareness. From unconscious force, through necessary defense, toward conscious art, the progression of a power finding across generations and 2 supernatural transformations, the form it had always been moving toward. Edward understood, sitting with his daughter's small hand pressed against his face and feeling her show him things she had chosen to show him. Images of her day, feelings she wanted him to know she had, see the particular quality of her love offered directly and without distance into the mind of the person she was offering it to. That this was the most profound confirmation the theory had ever received. Not because it proved anything in the formal sense, not because it constituted evidence that a skeptic could not dispute, but because it completed the picture in a way that felt like recognition rather than discovery. Like arriving at a place you had been moving toward without knowing you were moving toward it, and finding it exactly as it needed to be. The shield was not an accident. It was not a random gift, distributed without pattern to a person who happened to carry the right biological lottery ticket into a vampire transformation. And it was the endpoint of a line that had been drawing itself across generations, through Renee's unconscious projection, through Charlie's constitutional quietness, through the specific and sustained pressure of a childhood spent at the intersection of those two inheritances, through the long and unwitnessed work of a developing mind, building the only home it had ever been able to completely call its own. And Renesmee, born at the far end of that line, carrying in her hybrid biology the traces of everything that had led to her, was not the contradiction of Bella's shield. She was its echo, transformed by inheritance and amplified by possibility into something that faced outward instead of inward, that offered instead of protected, that reached toward instead of sealed against. The greatest gift Bella had ever possessed had not been given to her by the transformation. It had been built by her in the most ordinary circumstances available, from the most ordinary materials, pressure and time, and the quiet, unannounced, entirely unconscious determination of a child who needed to stay herself. The transformation had made it permanent, but it had always been real. It had been real from the first moment a small girl in Phoenix had learned, without knowing she was learning anything, that the inside was worth keeping, that the self was worth the work of protecting, that the most important territory in any person's life is the one that belongs only to them. Come back now. Slowly. Let the theory settle the way all true things settle, not with the sharp finality of a conclusion, but with the quiet and gradual weight of something that has found its right place and intends to stay there. There is an image that will not leave. Once you have followed this story all the way back to its beginning, a child in a warm apartment in Phoenix, the particular quality of afternoon light through windows that face west, the kind of light that arrives golden and unhurried and makes everything it touches look like it has been there forever. The sound of the city outside, distant and continuous. The ambient noise of a world that is busy with its own concerns and has no awareness of the small, careful life being lived inside this particular set of rooms. The smell of something on the stove that Bella has started because dinner needed to be started, and she was the one who noticed, the one who always noticed, and the one whose attention to the practical requirements of the household had long since become so automatic that it no longer registered as attention at all, simply as seeing what needed to be done, and doing it, and moving on. Renee is somewhere in the apartment, vivid and warm and entirely herself, her thoughts filling the available space with the same generous unconscious abundance that they always fill every available space. Her presence as pervasive and as simply there as weather. She is not doing anything unkind. She is not demanding anything that she is explicitly asked for. She is simply being Renee, large and bright and boundlessly alive in the particular way that some people are alive, in a way that asks nothing of the room and takes everything from it simultaneously, without awareness of either the asking or the taking. And Bella, in the kitchen, keeping herself, not performing self-preservation, not executing a strategy, not maintaining through conscious effort a barrier she has decided to erect against a threat she has recognized and named, simply being who she is, which is, at this point in her development, already the person the theory describes, already the person whose interior stays interior as automatically as breathing, whose feelings are fully present and fully real and fully hers, without any of them traveling outward into the available space where her mother's feelings have always been sufficient to fill every corner. Already the person who understands others with a fluency that no one around her has recognized as the extraordinary thing it is, because it looks from the outside like simple attentiveness, like kindness, like the natural disposition of a quiet girl who pays attention. No one is watching this. No one knows that anything is being built. Renee does not know. Charlie, far away in Forks, does not know. The friends Bella has at school, acquaintances, really, in the specific sense that friendship requires a quality of mutual access she has never quite developed the capacity to perform, do not know. Bella herself does not know. The building is happening below every available threshold of awareness, in the deep organizational processes of a mind doing what minds do when the world requires it of them. Adapting, becoming, laying down, one ordinary day at a time, the architecture of what she will eventually be. She does not know that a vampire will one day reach for her mind and find nothing. She does not know that the nothing he finds will be the most extraordinary thing he has encountered in a century of encountering everything. She does not know that the silence she carries so naturally, so without effort, so completely without awareness, that it is not simply the absence of noise, but a structure. She does not know that this silence will one day be recognized as the most powerful defensive ability in a world she has not yet discovered exists. She knows none of this. She knows only the apartment and the light and the sound of something cooking and the warm and overwhelming presence of her mother moving through the rooms and the small, sufficient, entirely private territory of her own interior, where everything that is hers remains hers, untouched and whole. That is where it began, not in a mythology, and not in a supernatural event or a moment of transformation, or any of the dramatic origins that power tends to be assigned in the stories people tell about power. In a kitchen in Phoenix, on an ordinary afternoon, in the unremarkable and entirely private act of a child holding on to herself. Edward knows this now. He has traced it all the way back, across the months of knowing her and the years that followed, across the careful assembly of everything the theory required to become complete. Charlie's constitutional quietness, Renee's overwhelming projection, the specific and sustained pressure of the childhood at their intersection, the long, unwitnessed work of a developing mind building what it needed from the only materials available to it. He has traced it back to that kitchen, to that afternoon, to the child who was only surviving and did not know she was building anything at all. And now, on the evenings when he sits in the particular quiet that Bella carries with her into every room she enters, the quiet that is not the absence of sound, but the presence of a mind that has no external face, that gives the landscape of his consciousness the only still point it has ever known. He does not experience it as an absence anymore. He experiences it as what it is, as the evidence of everything she survived, as the shape of everything she kept, as the permanent and crystalline and absolutely inviolable record of a child who needed to stay herself, and did, and built something extraordinary from nothing more than that necessity. Rest now. Let the story settle into the quiet it came from. Somewhere in the darkness behind your eyes, in the private and protected territory of your own interior, let Bella's silence find its echo. The most powerful thing she ever built began exactly where you are right now, in the still, unhurried, entirely sufficient country of a mind that belongs only to itself. Carry it with you into sleep. It will be there when you wake. It has always been there. It was there long before anyone knew it mattered. Good night.